people. We wait to see what happens when what we expect to be the larger Fatah-linked protest takes place in a few minutes' time, maybe an hour's time.
All right, Harry Fawcett there in Hebron, live for us. Harry, thank you. Stay safe. Let's cross over to Bernard Smith. He's live from Damascus Gate in occupied East Jerusalem. Bernard, and further confrontations over the last week at Al-Aqsa over what the Palestinians say have been further attempts by Israeli security forces to assert control over the mosque compound.
Yes, Darren, quiet here at the moment because prayers have started. This is Damascus Gate, one of the entrances into the old city and onto the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. But there has been tension this week because of a decision by the Israeli authorities to reseal a gate that gave access to a meeting room in the compound. Now, this meeting room has been closed by court order for the last 16 years because a group that met in there was, the court says, sympathetic or working with Hamas. The thing is, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound is supposed to be managed by the Waqf on behalf of the Jordanian royal family and the Palestinians. And the Waqf say, we want to get back into that room. It's 16 years since that group met there. It's long disbanded. We want to open it, get back in there and renovate it. And there's been this tussle on locking and unlocking this gate, and this has created tensions because the Israeli authorities are not supposed to be on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. It is under the control of the Waqf, and yet another example, the Palestinians would say, of Israel trying to influence what happens on that compound. They already can control who comes in and out. There are security cameras everywhere, and the Israelis will say, of course, they do all of this for security reasons, and they'll point to the Western Wall where anybody, Jewish worshippers or anyone, has to go through similar security controls. Down the Palestinians will say they are under occupation, and that's the difference.
Yeah, and Bernard, the Israeli Prime Minister has again raised the spectre of security and too many concessions being given to Palestinians if a new centrist coalition wins the election coming up in April.
And he's done this, Darren, because this centrist group poses a very real threat, the first real threat there has been to Netanyahu keeping hold of the premiership here in Israel. This centrist group made up of Benny Gantz, a former military chief of staff, and Yair Lapid, a former finance minister. Between them, the latest polls suggest they could get around 34 seats in the Knesset, their parties between them. Netanyahu's grouping only gets around 30. So Netanyahu worried that this could result in his ejection from office. So he's raised this spectre of too many concessions being given to the Palestinians, of the threat to security if this coalition gets power. And also, as Harry referred to, Netanyahu has now allowed two very far right-wing parties to join forces, and they will give him support in a future government. And in return for that support, they will get the education and housing ministries. So a government that's already pretty right-wing by Israeli standards could be even more right-wing if Netanyahu and this grouping win power again in April's elections. Darren.
Bernard, thank you. Plenty more still to come here on the News Hour, including too little too late. Pope Francis's plans to combat sexual abuse by Catholic priests are dismissed. And a stark warning from the UN. Find out why a decline in animal and plant species means a drop in our food supply. And in sport, the former world #1 was on target for his first tour title of the year. That's all still to come. Now, it's day 2 of a meeting at the Vatican looking at sexual abuse by priests. We'll see more testimonies from victims. Some of them have already dismissed an action plan presented by Pope Francis on Thursday as not going far enough. Well, the head of the Roman Catholic Church has been hosting a 4-day summit to address the scandal. Well, Rory Challens joins us live now from Vatican City. Rory, so it's day 2 of this summit being led by the Pope. Remind us of what he wants to get from it.
Well, what he wants is to impress on the clergy that have gathered here the severity of the crisis that the Catholic Church faces at the moment, the suffering of so many thousands of victims of sexual abuse across the Catholic world going back decades, and that it is their shared responsibility to do something about it. And as you just mentioned there is this, what he's calling reflection points, a 21-point document which is a kind of working template for how this is going to progress. And it has bits of technical language in it, like creating listening structures and shared procedures, etc. But what it is a practical handbook for Catholic authorities to process sexual abuse allegations going forward. It is not popular, I have to say, at the moment with some survivors of sexual abuse. And we can bring in now Tim Law, who is a founding member of ACCRA, which is a group called Ending Clergy Abuse. Now, Tim, you can tell us, why do you not particularly like this document here?
Rory, we are outraged and feel betrayed by these 21 points. Back in August, Pope Francis wrote a letter. This was not comments on the bus or on the airplane as he normally did. This was a letter to the people of God, basically to the whole world, recognizing that zero tolerance was necessary for abuse and for the cover-up of the abuse. That there's no more time to delay. We need to take action. Action is necessary. Then September, the month following, he calls for this summit. Out of the blue, a spectacular gesture, and you tie the two together, zero tolerance summit, and the expectations were reasonable and high that this summit would deal with zero tolerance. So then comes this document, and the word is not even mentioned. There's nothing in this document that even comes remotely close to zero tolerance. And so, again, it's an outrage and a betrayal to what he promised in August.
So it doesn't go far enough, basically. But so you know something about the internal workings of the Catholic Church. What is it that there might be that is going on behind closed doors that we don't see necessarily, tensions that might be preventing the kind of progress that you want to see?
Well, again, we can only guess because they don't share with us, but we believe that, we know that 2/3 of the bishops here are from the developing countries, and that they are putting pressure, we believe, on Francis not to enact a zero tolerance policy as a universal law of the Church. And Francis, I think, is inclined to do that, but if he does that, there could be a revolt of the bishops from Africa and Asia particularly, and he doesn't want to deal with that, and doesn't want to become the Gorbachev of the Church, because that change, as reasonable as it sounds, could have a profound influence on the Church and the hierarchy.
So you think that Pope Francis is more vulnerable than he seems?
Yes. I don't believe there's any. I don't believe he's going to resign. I don't think his constitution is made up to do that. A very stubborn man, so determined man, and so I don't think he's going to do a Pope Benedict. Although there's lots of forces out there that are trying to create that situation. That's not ACCRA's position. We want to protect children around the world, and these bishops are protecting themselves first and children second, if at all.
Tim, thank you very much for speaking to us there. That was Tim Law from the pressure group for survivors of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, ACCRA. This summit still has 2 more days to go on it, but as we heard from Tim there, if it doesn't come out with a zero tolerance policy by the end of it, groups and survivors like ACCRA and its members won't be satisfied with what this has come up with.
Rory, thank you. Now, Nigerians head to the polls for the presidential election on Saturday. It was postponed just 5 hours before polls were due to open. So with the extra time to prepare, are things now in place? Well, there are concerns the delay and fears of ethnic violence could lower voter turnout. Well, Jonah Hull is live for us in Abuja. Jonah, so the election had to be postponed for a week. I mean, do officials feel they're much better prepared for the big day tomorrow?
Darren, bear in mind that INEC, the Independent Electoral Commission that oversees the election process here, claimed that it was 100% ready for the vote right up until the last minute last week, when it surprised many, outraged many by delaying the vote just hours before the polls opened on Saturday morning, as you mentioned there. They blamed logistical difficulties, a late finishing primary season that delayed the printing of ballots, the distribution of ballots, sabotage, the burning down of a number of INEC distribution centres, and bad weather that prevented planes from getting off the ground to distribute ballots around the country. Well, they've had just a week to put all of that right, in addition to which they've had to carry out complicated audits of the materials that were distributed to ensure they haven't been tampered with in the interim. But INEC now says again that it is ready. A commissioner I heard speaking a day or two ago said only an act of God would stand in the way of this election going ahead. And early this morning, President Muhammadu Buhari put out a statement to the country urging voters to cast aside their doubts and fears and come out to vote. His main rival, Atiku Buhari, made a similar appeal to his Atiku Abubakar, I beg your pardon, to his supporters on Twitter to come out and vote. So the scene does appear set now for Nigerians to take to the polls on Saturday morning in their presidential election. Here's my report.
Stars of Nigeria's film and dance world in a video promoting a peaceful election. There are concerns about the country's ability to hold a successful presidential poll this weekend after last Saturday's surprise delay, and some fear a return of ethnic violence triggered in the past by disputed results.
With the background that we already have, in which there's so much suspicion and misgivings and so on, either about INEC, about security agencies, about the government itself, and so on and so forth, there's a high risk that results will be disputed. People will protest the results in some places, and there's a high risk of violence.
In a crowded field of candidates, two stand out. President Muhammadu Buhari, whose critics say he's failed on the economy, fighting corruption and insecurity, and one-time Vice President Atiku Abubakar, accused of corruption but promising business-friendly policies and jobs. Despite reassurances by the government and the Independent Election Commission INEC that the poll will happen this time and be free and fair, trust in the process has been dented. Not that public trust in government was all that high to begin with.
The problem is not only on me, it's on everybody in this very Nigeria. You can see one, after spending so many years in the university, one will come out, be betting and hunting for job without no job, without job.
And why do you think that is?
The country